Hello friends, today we are going to read a poem by Philip Larkins. You would find the text of this poem, I Remember, on page 83 of block 10. There is a unit, that is unit number 49 in block 10, in which we have tried to teach you something about Philip Larkin and his poetry. The unit writer has outlined the background of the poetry of Philip Larkin. Philip Larkin is the most important figure in what is called the movement poetry. The expression "the movement" was coined just a year after the death of Thomas, that is, the term movement was coined by the editor of The Spectator in 1954, that is J.D. Scott. J.D. Scott coined the term the movement, who was the editor of The Spectator. It was in 1953 that Dylan Thomas died, and a reaction against his poetry set in. In 1955, a collection of poetry edited by D.J. Enright was published. This was called Poets of the 1950s. In 1956, another anthology of the movement poets was published by Robert Conquest. The title of this collection was New Lines. But by 1957, its members began to disown what was called the movement. And as John Wayne said, its work is done. That is, the work of the movement was over by 1957. In actual terms, the movement died out by 1957, but in a real sense, it lived on. The 50s saw the rise of what is known as the angry young men. Writers such as Alan Sillitoe, Kingsley Amis. Kingsley Amis was a friend of Philip Larkin at Oxford, where a few other writers such as John Wayne, Donald Davy, Elizabeth Jennings, and Robert Conquest came together. And these were the leading figures of the movement. What was the manifesto, if we may term it so, of the movement? The aim of the movement poets was to de-glamorize, de-romanticize the worldview of people such as Dylan Thomas, and in fact even the great romantic poets such as Wordsworth, Shelley and Keats. They also did not believe in the experimental character of a literary work of art such as we find in the modernist poets such as T.S. Eliot. I Remember was published in a volume of poems called The Less Deceived. This was published in 1955. Before the publication of The Less Deceived, Larkin had already published a work such as Jill. You would remember that he passed out from Oxford in 1943 with a double first. And in 1945, he made his debut with a collection of poems called The North Ship. If you compare the poems of The North Ship, that is the volume of poems published in 1945, you would find that by the time The Less Deceived was published, Larkin had gained confidence as a poet. He could manipulate speech much more felicitously than he had done in The North Ship. Let me read the poem called The North Ship, which is just one of the poems in the volume of that name. I saw 3 ships go sailing by over the sea, the lifting sea, and the wind rose in the morning sky, and one was rigged for a long journey. The first ship turned towards the west, over the sea, the running sea, and by the wind was all possessed and carried to a rich country. The second ship turned towards the east, over the sea, the quaking sea, and the wind hunted it like a beast to anchor in captivity. The third ship drove towards the north, over the sea, the darkening sea, but no breath of wind came forth, and the decks shone frostily. The northern sky rose high and black over the proud, unfruitful sea. East and west the ships came back, happily or unhappily. But the third went wide and far into an unforgiving sea, under a fire-spilling star, and it was rigged for a long journey. There is some kind of symbolism in the North Ship. The three ships represent some idea, but the poem has more discipline. Larkin is trying to discover his language, his voice. He is sure that he is not going to write free verse, as did Eliot and Yeats and Auden. It is clear that he has chosen to go back to the form of poetry that the English people were more familiar with. It is also clear that Larkin would not make his poetry a field for experiments. He would not build into it all the learning, all the wisdom, all the knowledge acquired by a European man in his work of art. It is also clear that Larkin would give up, would have nothing to do with the romantic stance such as you find here in East and West. The ships came back happily or unhappily. There is no glamour in the idea of these of the three ships about which Philip Larkin is talking here. But this is not yet the true Philip Larkin we value him for. The true Philip Larkin is at times an uncomfortable Larkin. Uncomfortable for us because he breaks, for instance, the etiquettes of the society. I'll give you an example from a poem called This Be the Verse. He writes, "They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time wear soppy stern and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself." This is a somber poem, but this is a poem more akin to the language of the people, the language of the common people, not of the elite, not of the civilized, not of the upper middle class Englishman. This is the language of the man and the woman in the street. The modernist poets wrote poetry for one another, and for the professors at Oxford and Cambridge. Philip Larkin wrote poetry which was meant to be understood, which was a creation of, in the language of the men and women who spoke them. Philip Larkin has been called the poet of dirty words. The poet of dirty words. And you find these dirty words again and again in his poetry, especially as he grew older. In one of his last poems, called Annus Mirabilis, he comes up with a startling, if not shocking, revelation. He says, sexual intercourse began in 1963. Larkin was born in 1922. So almost when he was 41. Sexual intercourse began in 1963, which was rather late for me, between the end of the Chatterley Ban and the Beatles' first LP. He measures his existence on a cultural plane. Philip Larkin is a man of the people, and Lady Chatterley's lovers, D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's lovers, was banned, and the Beatles' LPs were being produced in the early 60s. Up till then, there'd only been a sort of bargaining, a wrangle for a ring, a shame that started at 16 and spread to everything. Then all at once the quarrels sank. Everyone felt the same, and every life became a brilliant breaking of the bank, a quite unlosable game. So life was never better than in 1963, though just too late for me, between the end of the Chatterley Ban and the Beatles' first LP. Notice, you could say that Larkin is offering you a trite, a pedestrian experience. But the poetry of Annus Mirabilis, incidentally, the title of one of Dryden's poems, in which he celebrated the reigning monarch. So there are voices within Larkin's poems. I remember is a take on Thomas Hood's Past and Present. You would find this poem in Palgrave's Golden Treasury. Past and Present of Thomas Hood reads as follows. I remember the house where I was born, the little window where the sun came peeping in at morn. He never came a wink too soon, nor brought too long a day, but now I often wish the night had borne my breath away. This is exaggeration, I often wish the night had borne my breath away. The exaggeration is not supported by the context. Hood goes on. I remember the roses red and white, the violets and the lily cups, those flowers made of light. The violets and the lily cups, those flowers made of light. The lilacs where the robin built and where my brother sat. The laburnum on his birthday, the tree is living yet. I remember where I was used to swing and thought the air must rush as fresh to swallows on the wing. My spirit flew in feathers then, that is so heavy now, and summer pools could hardly cool the fever on my brow. I remember the fir trees dark and high. I used to think their slender tops were close against the sky. It was a childish ignorance, and now it's little joy to know I am farther off from heaven than when I was a boy. Thomas Hood was a contemporary of Charles Lamb and an acquaintance of his. John Clare, the farmer poet, and Thomas De Quincey, the author of a famous autobiography. And you find the influence of the romantic poets on Hood when he says, to know I am farther off from heaven than when I was a boy. If you read Wordsworth's ode to the intimations of immortality, you would find him saying, heaven lies about us in our infancy. Larkin does none of those things. The frame background of the poem is a sudden arrival by train to Coventry. And the lyric captures the experiences of the short period of time that he finds himself at Coventry station. Coming up England by a different line, for once, early in the cold new year, we stopped, and watching men with number plates sprint down the platform to familiar gates. Why, Coventry! I exclaimed. I was born here. Notice how, like Alexander Pope, Larkin brings in the actual words of the spoken language into his poetry. You may recall the opening of Epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. And here you notice Larkin referring to his town with an image. Men with number plates. We stopped and watching men with number plates sprint down the platform to familiar gates. Coventry was a center of car industry. In Mr. Bleaney, you would remember he talks about the bodies. That is how he calls his town. This was Mr. Bleaney's room. I am reading on page 85 of Block 10. This was Mr. Bleeney's room. He stayed the whole time he was at the bodies till they moved him. He was at the bodies. The bodies refers to Coventry. Here, the number plates refer to Coventry. Cars have number plates. Jacques Derrida, in an essay called The Supplement of Copula, Philosophy Before Linguistics, says, language has an illogical element, the metaphor. It might be illogical, but metaphors capture, images hold our experiences as human beings, limited as we are. Coming up England by a different line, for once early in the cold new year, we stopped and watching men with number plates sprint down the platform to familiar gates. Why, Coventry, I exclaimed, I was born here. Notice the felicitous expression, sprint down the platform to familiar gates. Sprint for running is an effective use of the word which pictures reality so effectively. I leaned far out and squinted for a sign, and this was still the town that had been mine. Notice Larkins's picture of himself. He leans far out and then squinties for a sign. He looks askance, sideways. He is not eyeing the whole scene where he had lived. There is some degree of duplicity in his stance, which is reflected in his poetry. There was duplicity in his life. Larkin never married, and however, he had at one time 3 girlfriends. These were Monica Jones, whom he had met in 1947 at Leicester. She was a lecturer in English there. Maeve Brennan, who was a member of his staff at the University of Hull, and Betty Mackereth, his personal secretary. In spite of his love for 3 women, he never gave himself entirely to anyone. He used them, as his biographers have said, to create his poetry. There is some degree of duplicity in a poet, in the poet. Deprivation for me was like the daffodils to Wordsworth. Larkins had said, and this deprivation was a painstakingly nurtured deprivation for Larkin. I leaned far out and squinted for a sign that this was still the town that had been mine so long, but found I wasn't even clear which side was which. From where those cycle crates were standing, had we annually departed for all those family halls. He remembers the place from where he departed for family holidays. Family holidays are great time for young children. But he hides the fact, just as he hides the fact of his girlfriends, his love life from his readers. So does he hide the fact of his happiness. He painstakingly cultivates he effectively, efficiently cultivates the stance, the attitude of deprivation. From where those cycle crates were standing, had we annually departed for all those family halls? There is a question mark. And there is a gap. And then he goes on. A whistle went. Things moved. I sat back, staring at my boots. Was that, my friend smiled, where you have your roots? This is speech at in its colloquial form. Was that, my friend smiled, where you have your roots? No, only where my childhood was unspent. I wanted to retort, just where I started. But by now I have got the whole place clearly charted. Our garden first, where I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits, and wasn't spoken to an old hat. And here we have that splendid family I never ran to when I got depressed. Surely there must have been many much better things to be remembered. Eva Larkin, his mother, has been called a cossetting mother. She went to any extent to make life pleasant for her family. His father was demanding, but he left behind in him a love for literature, especially Thomas Hardy. They could not have left Larkin without any impression, warm and affectionate. However, this is how Philip Larkin remembers them. By now I have got the whole place clearly charted. Our garden first, where I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits. This is what Harold Bloom would have called the anxiety of influence. Philip Larkin is trying to make a niche for himself. I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits. And we remember Ode to Intimations of Immortality, where Wordsworth shelters under Platonic philosophy. Our birth is a forgetting. You would find an extract from this poem in block 10. The soul that rises with us, our life star, hath and elsewhere its setting, and cometh from afar, not in entire forgetfulness, and not in utter nakedness, but trailing clouds of glory do we come from God, who is our home. Heaven lies about us in our infancy. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. The youth who daily farther from the east must travel still is nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. This is what Larkin is critical of. He is critical also of a poem such as Fernhill, which is even more romantic, which is even more passionate. And so he says, I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits, and wasn't spoken to by an old hat. Wordsworth, in the prelude, tells us how nature made him into a poet, and also when he did something wrong, chastised him. Larkin says there was no such thing. Nature did not come to him as a philosopher, and wasn't spoken to by an old hat. And here we have that splendid family I never ran to when I got depressed. The boys all biceps and the girls all chest. This is the real Philip Larkin coming to the fore. The boys all biceps and the girls all chest. Their comic ford, their farm where I could be really myself. I'll show you, come to that, the bracken where I never trembling sat. The bracken is a kind of wild plant that grows on hills and in forests. The word bracken comes from the Swedish word bracken. I'll show you, come to that, the bracken where I never trembling sat, determined to go through with it, where she lay back, and all became a burning mist. And in those offices my doggerel was not set up in blunt 10-point, nor read by a distinguished cousin of the mayor. Philip Larkin effectively, painstakingly sketches his picture, as it were, of what Lollet Kubi has called an uncommon poet for the common man. An uncommon poet for the common man. He is a poet of the common man, and still he is not a common poet. He says, my doggerel, he doesn't calls his verse poetry. He says, my doggerel was not set up in blunt 10-point, nor read by a distinguished cousin of the mayor, who didn't call and tell my father there before us, had we the gift to see ahead. You look as though you wish the place in hell. Once again, the spoken voice is back in this poem. You remember Pope's opening lines. Shut, shut the door, good John, fatigued I said. Tie up the knocker, say I am sick, I am dead. The dog star rages, no, it's past a doubt. All Bedlam, all Parnassus is let out. But Alexander Pope is dramatic. Alexander Pope was conscious of his high station as a poet. Philip Larkin is also conscious of his high status as a poet, but he pretends to be a man among common people, a man of the common people, a poet of the common people. He says, my doggerel was not set up in blunt 10-point, nor read by a distinguished cousin of the mayor, who didn't call and tell my father there before us, had we the gift to see ahead. You look as though you wish the place in hell. He is interrupted by his friend in the train. You look as though you wish the place in hell, my friend said, judging from your face. Oh well, I suppose it's not the place's fault. Oh well, I suppose it's not the place's fault, I said. Nothing like something happens anywhere. Nothing like something happens anywhere. This bold, isolated line, nothing like something happens anywhere, casts a shadow, as it were, on the whole poem. And yet, the device is not unfamiliar. The final couplet in Shakespeare's sonnets also give a new meaning to the whole poem. Here, nothing like something happens anywhere, casts a shadow on the whole poem, that is, I remember, I remember. Through I remember, Larkin builds himself, tries to place himself among poets such as Dylan Thomas, Wordsworth, Thomas Hood, Charles Lamb, Byron, and many others who celebrated their childhood in lofty images. Philip Larkin cunningly presents a different point of view and thus makes a niche for himself in the hall of English poetry. He makes a solid attempt to become an uncommon poet of the common man. And it is for this reason that I remember is a great poem. You may like to read a few other poems by Philip Larkin that you have in your text. क्या हुआ, बिजली चली गई? नहीं सर, ओह अच्छा, तुम लोग इसको दोबारा से क्यों देंगे, वाइंड अप कर दीजिएगा बस. हाँ ठीक है. I remember, as I have pointed out, appeared in the second volume of Philip Larkin's poetry called The Less Deceived. The idea of the less deceived comes from Hamlet, where Hamlet is feigning madness and says, I did love you once, and then goes on and says, I loved you not. And Ophelia responds, I was the more deceived. Philip Larkin recasts these words into what he calls the less deceived. In one of the very passionate poems that you find in this volume less, the less deceived is deceptions. It is about a Victorian account given by Henry Mayhew. I am reading from page 557 of The Golden Treasury. It is about a girl who is drugged by a few men and then raped. And I would read out just the second stanza, which says, "Slums, years have buried you. I would not dare console you if I could. What can be said except that suffering is exact? What can be said except that suffering is exact? But where desire takes charge, readings will grow erratic. For you would hardly care that you were less deceived. But you would hardly care that you were less deceived. And on that bed, than he was, stumbling up the breathless stair to burst into fulfillment's desolate attic." He says that the girl who had been raped was less deceived. The victim in any encounter is less deceived than the victor, because the victor bears the guilt which the victim does not. This is the voice of